Good day, this is Jeff Mansell from New Testament History Interpretation with a fresh installment on some information I thought was important for us to grapple with as we continue to work our way through the important study of biblical exegesis, especially as it relates to the New Testament and the era following the writing of the New Testament and the birth of the Christian Church. We've been looking at several things in recent weeks, and I wanted to touch on just three quick items. One dealing with word studies, the other kind of an era, which involves the Reformation and the Enlightenment, and then finally wrap up with a few comments on the idea of redaction criticism. Spending time doing word studies is an important function that is associated with biblical exegesis. As we study a passage of Scripture, a specific verse or set of verses, we'll find that not every word needs to be parsed or broken down. It's just not necessary, nor is it time efficient. But within any given verse or passage of Scripture, there are going to be a number of key words, and I think that's an important word to take into consideration, is the idea of key words that help understand the meaning of the verse, and unlocking their understanding is going to be essential to getting to the root meaning of this particular passage. And so I would say, first of all, number one, we don't need to look at all the words, but there are some key words. And then secondly, as you continue to process this endeavor, you're going to land on a pattern that will work for you and help you to efficiently break down and understand these key words in a specific passage as you do a word study. I would say, first of all, also, that as you work through this word study process, the net result is going to be a series of meanings, quite often, that are associated with the word that you're studying. We speak of this as a range of meanings, and so a given word can have multiple words associated with it, but only a few of those, or even just one of those meanings, is going to be applicable to the specific verse or passage that you're dealing with. And quite often, that's going to be governed by the context. And so knowing what is happening around the verse, what this particular chapter or even the entire book is trying to cover, will be important in narrowing down that range of meanings to the specific meaning that is involved with the word that you're studying. If you're not a student of the ancient language, primarily Greek and Hebrew, there are a number of good resources still available to help facilitate this process. One of those, I'm sure many of you have found to be beneficial, is the use of concordances. One familiar one is Strong's Concordance. And as you read through the New Testament, and the Old Testament for that matter as well, you'll find each of the words listed, as well as in the back of the concordance, a corresponding definition that goes with the word in the verse that you're studying. So Strong's, so concordances, several different kinds, are very beneficial to the work of word study. Dictionaries are also beneficial. I would have one word of caution, however, and that is when you're looking at dictionaries, while secular dictionaries like a Webster is beneficial, it oftentimes misses the specific nuances that are particular to a theological term. And so while as looking at Webster's is a good practice, having a solid theological dictionary on hand is valuable in the process also. One additional resource I want to draw to your attention that I have in my library, and it's an older resource, but it's Word Studies by Kenneth Wiest. This particular volume deals with Mark, and I like what it says right here, Greek New Testament for the English reader. And so you don't have to be an expert in the original languages to be able to find good information from very credible sources to help us understand these key words that we're trying to break down to arrive at an appropriate understanding of the text. And so word studies are important. They're going to be valuable to our exegetical work in breaking down the Scriptures. And again, as you work through the process, you're going to develop a process, a pattern that works for you. And I just trust that you'll be able to augment that with good sources. As we work through the New Testament era leading up to today, contemporary times, we pass through a time known as the Reformation, and closely on its heels then also the Age of Enlightenment. We often associate the man Martin Luther with the Reformation era. He was a Catholic monk who had an awakening in his soul and took exception with the sale of indulgences and some other practices that were involved with the Catholic Church of his time. And he nailed to the cathedral door there in Wittenberg the 95 theses or statements of things that he took exception to. But around him also were individuals that were important to this era. Before him was a man named Wycliffe that was important in the area of translating scriptures. Luther himself sought to put the scriptures into the German language. He was a German monk, and so he wanted to get the language into his own people. Essential to his theology was salvation by faith and not by works, and also the importance of Scripture, basing our theology and doctrine on what the Scriptures have to say. Following on behind him is another famous character named Calvin, John Calvin. Interesting enough, their theologies, while somewhat similar in the Protestant range, have some divergence, and as I think of Calvin, I often think about the sovereignty of God, and he was very extreme in that area. In fact, growing out of Calvin's theology are the doctrines of predestination and the eternal security. And so the Reformation is an important era. It really divides the Christian church from what was formerly an East and a West, now into a Catholic and a Protestant, as well as Orthodox types of Christian church. And so most of us, many of us, are of the Protestant tradition, and that is where our roots go back to. Following on the heels of the Protestant Reformation is the Age of Enlightenment. It really, as I think about it, is the elevation of man. It's the age of reason, and it doesn't dispense with God. In fact, many people that were of the Age of Enlightenment and embraced and even led its teachings were people who believed in God, but introduced a new form of theology called deism. Deism believes that there is a God, but that God lacks personal attention to what's happening in today's world. It's kind of like he created the world, set it into motion, and then left it to run on its own. And so deism is a part of many of our founding fathers' theology. They were godly individuals. They would have seen value in the teachings of the Scriptures, and in fact, many scriptural principles are woven into the United States Constitution. And so things of Christianity were important, but their opinion of God's relationship with man is a bit skewed from what we would believe in the evangelical tradition, which makes it very relational. And so these are our two areas that we pass through on our way to coming into the 21st century. And we'll cover a couple others as this particular course progresses. But we pass through that particular era in our week 4 studies of New Testament history and interpretation. Finally, just a comment on a chapter in our book by Hayes and Holliday that dealt with redaction criticism. We have covered a variety of styles of criticisms, form criticism, tradition criticism. One of those that we have studied recently then is the idea of redaction criticism. And redaction is synonymous with the idea of editing. And as you read their text, you find that it actually applies to the original authors of Scripture. So we're talking about the autographs, the original writings of the authors of Scripture. and whether or not they were using previous information, whether it was written or oral traditions, in drafting their own biblical book that was introduced into the canon. One specific area that is under great study, it deals with the Gospels. And as you look at the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we realize that three of those, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are what we call the Synoptic Gospels. And in many people's minds, Mark was the first one written, with Matthew and Luke using that as source material for writing their own. We've also talked about the source Q, or Quell, that comes from the German term source. And so in this particular situation, we would say that if Matthew and Luke are redactors, they were taking information that was being passed around in society, that were traditions, and used those to write their own Gospels. And our authors are telling us, Hayes and Holliday, that as we study redaction criticism and we look to those scholars who specialize in that, one of the things that we're getting at is trying to understand the theology that is behind these particular authors. We've come to find that as we have done our study of the Gospels, that each Gospel did have its particular focus. That there was a reason why we have multiple Gospels telling the life of Christ, because they were written, one, to different audiences. Matthew being written to a largely Jewish population, Mark to Romans, Gentiles, Luke to a group of Gentiles, and specifically one called Theophilus. And so who they were writing to, the style in which they wrote, and some of the theological emphases that they wished to make are coming through as we read their particular books. And so as we study redaction criticism, it helps us get to an understanding of what these individuals were trying to say. Well, those are a couple comments dealing with our studies from biblical exegesis and New Testament history and interpretation. I hope these additional comments help add to what you have been researching and studying on your own, and perhaps flesh out a few things that may have been a little bit of a mystery. It's a joy spending time with you. Hope that these moments are profitable, and we look forward to our time together again. Take care, and God bless.